The Unpaid Ledger. Season 2, Episode 7, The Field. Chapter 1. The bracelet had pulsed twice in the night. Short pulses, specific, like a phone line open with nobody on the other end. The second one came around 3. I lay there with my arm out of the blanket, the metal at my wrist warm, and tried to feel what it wanted. Whatever it had been doing, it was done. I gave up at 5 and made coffee on the stovetop, because the coffee maker had started leaving grounds in the cup again last week. The kitchen lamp was on its lowest setting and Eddie was in the armchair across the room, where he had been when I went to bed. I drank the coffee and waited for the city to come up. I was at my desk when April let herself in at 8:15, bag over her shoulder, morning's mail in her hand. I'd been catching pieces of her for 3 years, never on purpose, never all at once. This morning the bracelet vibrated against my pulse, and I had all of her, complete, before she'd finished pulling her coat off. I set the coffee down on the desk. The bracelet had been warm at my pulse since November. And the warmth wasn't new, what it had just done was. April said good morning from the front office, and I said it back. And she went to her desk and started in on the mail. Eddie had been watching me through all of it. He asked what that was, and I didn't have an answer yet. The bracelet had done something it hadn't done before. We both knew it. And neither of us wanted to say more than we already had. He floated that maybe it was a one-time thing, in the same voice he used when he didn't believe it himself. And I didn't either. I picked up the coffee, finished it standing, put the cup in the kitchen sink, and went back through to the office. April had the second of 3 envelopes open. I told her I'd be out for the morning if Nina Park called about Roxy's HR meeting. Take the message, I'd be back by noon. She said all right and didn't ask what I was doing. She'd stopped asking a couple of weeks back. I picked up my keys, put my coat on. From the front office, April was at her desk 30 feet away. I had her through the wall as clearly as if I'd been looking at her face. I closed the inner door behind me and went down the back stairs to the Taurus. The Taurus took 2 cranks to start, as it had been doing since the cold settled in, and I let it warm up for a minute. Eddie was in the passenger seat by the time I'd gotten the door closed. The radio was on the talk station I had left it on. A man going through traffic, and I let the man talk. Pulling out of the alley, I caught a sense off a woman walking her dog at the end of the block, 60 feet, give or take. A year-old grief settled in. I hadn't been trying for it. The bracelet had it for me before I'd registered her face. At the light at Birch, I picked up a man in a parked van 2 cars ahead, a lighter weight, recent and small. At the next block, a kid coming out of a bodega with a coffee, nothing on him to catch. Eddie was watching me out of the side of his eye. He said it sounded loud in there, and the bracelet was making that hard to argue with. He asked if it had been like that yesterday. I didn't think so, but I wasn't sure of anything that had happened yesterday after Marcus's. And I told him that. He let it go. I drove the rest of the way to Marcus's. My hand was loose on the wheel. The radio talked about traffic I didn't care about. Chapter 2. Marcus's shop was on a corner lot at the south end of his block, behind a hardware store that had been there longer than the block. He'd propped the back door with a brick when I came around. It was cold enough that a propped door said he'd been waiting a while. The kettle on the counter was already steaming. The chipped teapot was out, and a second cup sat across from his usual seat. A third cup without tea in it sat on the low shelf where Eddie always stood. Marcus pointed me to the chair without saying anything. I sat, and he poured. And I picked up the cup, at Marcus's "You picked up the cup." And my hands needed something to do. The cup was hot through the porcelain, and my right palm flexed against the heat. The scrape from last week wasn't there. It had healed faster than scrapes heal, and I had stopped checking it last night. I made the calls. he said. Clara doesn't know enough about this to be useful. She'd heard the term once, a long time ago, from someone who heard it from someone.
The man in Lancaster isn't picking up.
He may be alive and may not be. I'll keep trying. I told him I appreciated it, and he waved that off. What I did find, he said, I found in the written record. There's a journal in the back room I haven't opened in 20 years. Wasn't mine, was the man who taught me and his teacher before him. Most of it is housekeeping. But there's a section I remembered being there once I went looking. He set his hands flat on the table without picking up his cup. What this thing does before it hunts. It locates. It ranges. It listens for the signal, follows it inward, takes its time. It doesn't engage until the signal is loud enough to engage with. I told him that wasn't where I was. That's not where you are yet. He looked at me. Where you are is the bracelet has been quiet for 4 months and started not being quiet 2 days ago. The pull at the yard was the first time. It will not be the last. Every time the bracelet does work it didn't have to do. Every time it picks something up on its own. Every dissipation it absorbs. Every transaction it runs. That's signal. I had set my cup down without drinking from it. I asked him to tell me the rest. He told me. The bracelet had a function it had been waiting to disclose, and the disclosure had started last night and was continuing this morning. The function was range sensing, not the technique I used, but the bracelet doing the work for me, faster than I could without my asking. Every involuntary catch was a transaction, and every transaction was a beacon. I gave him the morning so far, April through the wall. The woman with the dog, the man in the van, the kid outside the bodega, and that none of those had been mine to ask for. I know you didn't ask for them, he said. I asked how I made it stop, and he took his time before answering. You learn to quiet it, or you stop working until you have. Eddie had not moved off the shelf. I told him I wasn't going to stop working. Then you need to learn fast, young man. I asked him how, and he told me what he could. The technique was something like the one a practitioner used to pick out one person in a room of 20. You picked your target, held your target, and let the rest fall to the ambient. The bracelet would still register the ambient. There was no off switch, but it would not run the full diagnostic on everybody in range. It would sit quiet against my wrist until I moved my attention. He said I would be bad at it for a while, and I told him I'd been bad at things before. Not this fast you haven't, young man, and not with this much riding on it. He stood. He'd been talking for a while and his back was tired, and asked if I'd come walk a block with him. He needed to drop a check at the laundromat across the way, and he wanted to say the next thing where the back room couldn't hear it. I told Eddie I'd be a few minutes. Eddie said all right. Marcus and I went out the back door and around to the front, and walked down to the corner of his block in the February light. Marcus said when we were past the second house that he had not told me everything in the back room because he had not wanted to say it where I had to think about Eddie hearing it. I told him to say it now. The bracelet is a vessel, he said. You and the bracelet together are a vessel. Eddie is on the other end of the bracelet, and has been since the foundry. What hunts vessels hunts what's in them. I stopped walking. Marcus took 2 steps before noticing and stopped too. We were on the sidewalk in front of a white-sided house with a chain-link fence and a maple that had given up its leaves the week before. I asked him to say it again, with different words. I needed it not to be ambiguous. What makes the bracelet a vessel, he said, picking each word, is what the bracelet is connected to. The bracelet itself is metal. What the metal holds is a tether. The tether terminates in your partner. A van turned up the cross street with oldies playing through an open window. Sinatra. Witchcraft, and for 2 seconds in the middle of the saxophone solo the broadcast went thin. A sustained drone underneath the song. neither part of the arrangement nor part of the static. The same drone the warehouse radio had carried at the foundry. Then the song came back over it, and the van turned at the next block. Marcus and I looked at each other. Neither of us said anything about what we had both heard. "How long do I have?" I said. Marcus took a moment with that. "If you do nothing, if you sit in your apartment with the bracelet quiet, weeks. Locating is patient. The signal stays at whatever level you leave it. If you keep doing involuntary range sensing because you can't stop it yet, days. If you do active work at range, pulls, dissipations, the kind of thing the bracelet does loud, measure it in hours. The louder the signal, the faster the locate, the closer to the engagement. That's the math of it as I read it." We walked the rest of the way to the laundromat without talking. Marcus dropped his check with the woman behind the counter, and we came back without talking. He stopped at the corner before the back door of his shop and touched my arm, and didn't add anything to what he had already said. I told him I knew, and he went in, and I went around to the Taurus. Eddie was in the passenger seat. The windshield had picked up condensation while I was gone, and Eddie had drawn a small line in it with his finger that I could see from outside the car. That was new, but I let it go for the minute. I got in. Eddie said Marcus had taken his time and gotten what he needed. He had a question, and worked around to it. And when he got there, I told him, yeah, Marcus had wanted to say something where Eddie wouldn't hear. He didn't ask what it was. He had figured out a long time ago when to ask and when not to. He looked at me sideways and changed the subject. "You walked half a block from the car," he said. I told him I had. He asked how it had worked, and I didn't have a clean answer. The bracelet hadn't gone tight on me. I'd felt him on the other end of it the way I'd been feeling him for 4 months. Not visible, not audible, just present, and hadn't lost him at 50 feet or 80 or 100 or 120. He'd been with me for the whole walk. And the only thing different was that we both noticed it after the fact instead of before. I asked when this had started for him. "Further back than it should have been," he said. "Probably yesterday, maybe before." He hadn't been measuring, and he should have been. The condensation on the windshield was clearing, and Eddie's line had gone with it. "This was the bracelet," I said, and he said it was, and didn't say anything else for a minute. I started the engine, pulled out of Marcus's lot, and headed back toward my side of the city. Chapter 3. April was on the phone when I came back to the office. She held a finger up, 1 minute, and finished the call. The referral was from a nurse named Aurora Diaz at Westside General, treating 3 patients separately for unrelated complaints that weren't resolving, same family, different presentations. Aurora had thought of me because she'd seen the pattern before. She wouldn't say where the previous 2 cases had gone. The siblings were named Alderton. Nora, Patrick, Linda, and their mother had died 18 months ago. I asked April when Nora was coming in. 1 o'clock if she confirmed, and I told her to confirm. She picked up the desk phone and confirmed while I hung my coat on the hook. Then put the phone down, looked at me, and asked if I was all right today. Long week. She gave me the look that meant long week wasn't going to cover it. Then she let it go and went back to her files. I went into the inner office, sat at the desk, and opened the drawer with the intake forms in it. I had to figure out how to do an intake on a person sitting across the desk from me when the bracelet was going to have her before she sat down. And I had no idea how I was going to do that. I had until 1 o'clock to figure it out, and worked Marcus's quiet drill on the man in the office across the alley while I waited. I could see him through the window, 40-something, tie loose, hunched over a keyboard. I picked him as a target and held him as a target, and the bracelet settled on him while the rest of the building dropped to a low ambient hum I could ignore without losing track of it. After 10 minutes, I let him go and took the building cold. Everything I had quieted came back at full volume. I put my hands flat on the desk and waited for my pulse to come back down. I did the drill twice more before 1 o'clock. Each time was a little better than the last. Marcus had not been wrong about how bad I was going to be at this. Nora Alderton came in at 1:05. She was tall for a woman in her late 40s, in a navy coat and dark slacks, with hair gone half gray and pulled back. She didn't look ill. She looked like a woman who had been trying to manage 3 people's worth of confusion for 2 years and had decided she wanted somebody else to look at it. I had her before April had gotten her coat off her. I'd picked her as a target the moment she walked in the front door. Same drill I'd been working all morning. The bracelet did the rest. The pass came clean and complete. Not pieces, not ambient, but the full picture, like a touch read. Placed cost, transferred post-death, 18 months in residence, distributed structure. I kept my hands flat on the desk, stood up to shake her hand, and walked back to the window where I had been working the drill all morning instead of sitting down across from her. My face stayed where I had put it. She sat while April hung her coat on the rack. Nora put her purse on the floor next to the chair, folded her hands in her lap, and waited for me to do whatever I was going to do. What I was going to do was hold 2 passes at once. I picked the keyboard man off the ambient, 40-something tie loose, still hunched over his work, and held him as a target while I walked Nora through intake from the window. He stayed clean and steady. The rest of the building dropped to the low hum it had been dropping to all morning. Nora watched me from the chair. She didn't ask why I was standing at the window. She had given up expecting any of this to make sense. I asked her the questions you ask anyone. How long? What symptoms? When did you first notice? Who else in your family? Anyone deceased in the past 2 years? She had been giving versions of the same answer to other doctors for 18 months. And the frustration had worn smooth. She had stopped expecting it to add up. Halfway through, she was telling me about her younger sister Linda, who had been sleeping 10 hours a night and waking up tired. The bracelet picked up a man in the hallway outside the office, on top of the keyboard target I was already holding, on top of the woman in front of me whose presence had been complete since she came through the door. He was carrying something heavy, not a placement, but something he had built himself over time. One wrong call at a time. Never learning, never stopping. The third catch came through the wall and the door in the front office, held for the length of his walk down the corridor, and fell off as he moved out of range. I held Nora and the man at the keyboard through the whole thing and didn't let either of them go. The drill that had been failing all morning was working under pressure. That was backwards. I came back to Nora and asked her about Patrick. Patrick was the oldest, 52, short-tempered the last 6 months, drinking more, unable to focus. The pattern matched what she had told me about Linda, and what she had come in here suspecting was there. I walked back to the desk before I gave her what I thought. Her mother, Elise, 66 when she died, had been a practitioner. Not a licensed one. She'd worked quietly out of a house on the South End for 40 years. Nora knew her mother had been spiritual, she said, and held a long breath after the word. She didn't know what that meant, and I gave her some of what it did. She listened and didn't interrupt, and when I was done she asked me if her mother had hurt them. I didn't think so, but I thought Ellis had been working on something when she died, and the work had been left open. And the 3 of them had been carrying parts of it without knowing. Nora Alderton sat in the client chair with her hands folded and her eyes on the corner of my desk for a long time. Then she said all right. Her brother and sister would come if she asked. She wanted to know when. I told her I needed to walk through their living spaces first. The next 2 days if she could manage it. She took out her phone and made the calls in the front office while April watched her with a kind of professional gentleness. When she came back in, she had Patrick at 3, Linda at 5:30, and Ellis's house tomorrow morning at 9. Nora still had the keys. She left at 1:40, and April closed the door behind her. I sat at the desk for the first time since Nora had come in. The bracelet was quiet against my wrist, and I thought about the man in the hallway who hadn't been mine. Chapter 4. Patrick Alderton lived on the second floor of a 4-unit walk-up on the east side, in a block of older houses cut up into apartments in the 70s that never quite recovered. I parked across the street and sat in the Taurus for a minute, and Eddie watched me try to settle. I worked the quiet drill on the block in front of me. There were maybe 40 people in the houses I could see through the windshield, and I picked Patrick. Second floor, back of the building, the window above the alley, and held him while the rest went quiet. He came in clear. The rest of the block came down to a low ambient hum I could ignore without losing track of it. The drill was working better than it had been in the office. Either I was getting better, unlikely after one day, or holding a target that mattered was easier than holding a stranger across an alley. Probably both. I told Eddie I was going up, and Eddie said all right. He'd be in the building when I was. And the car when I was, and I knew it without him having to say so. The front door of the walk-up was propped with a folded magazine. I went through. The hall was warm and stale, and the carpet on the stairs was old. I took the stairs to the second floor faster than the carpet deserved, stood at the landing with my breath even, and didn't think about it. Patrick's door was at the back, marked 2B in adhesive numerals from a hardware store. I knocked, and he took a minute to answer. He was Nora's brother, same height, same color hair gone further toward gray, same long face, and he hadn't shaved in a couple of days. He stepped back from the door and let me in without saying much. His weight was the heaviest of the 3 I'd carry that day, and the bracelet had been holding it for me at distance for 10 minutes, since before I came up the stairs. Since before I got out of the car. He pointed at the couch, and I didn't take it. I walked the apartment while he talked. Intake with Patrick went fast, because Nora had already done most of the work. He confirmed the timeline from where he was standing in the kitchen doorway. 18 months and change since his mother had died. Started to feel off about a year ago. Couldn't sleep. Couldn't focus. Snapped at people he didn't mean to snap at. Lost a freelance contract in October because he'd missed a deadline he hadn't known he was missing. I listened to him from the window. Then from the bookshelf. Then from the kitchen counter where I picked up an empty mug and put it down again, taking the apartment in as I took him in, both at once. No harder than holding one had been an hour ago. My doctor sent me to a sleep guy, he said. Sleep guy sent me to a psychiatrist. Psychiatrist sent me back to the doctor. Doctor said he didn't know. I told him I knew. He looked at me from the kitchen doorway and asked what I knew, and I gave it to him short from the bookshelf. Without moving closer, his mother was a practitioner. The work she'd been doing was unfinished, and he and his sisters had been carrying pieces of it. He listened without interrupting. And when I was done, he said his mother had been weird about a lot of things, and now some of it was making sense. And he didn't know how he felt about that. I told him he had a couple of days to sit with it. The work would happen at his sister Linda's house, with Linda and Nora present. And probably one other person Nora hadn't been in touch with in a long time. I didn't tell him about Delia. I didn't have her yet, and I told him to call me if anything got worse before the work. He said he would, and we crossed the apartment to the door and shook hands. The man in the hallway was right outside Patrick's apartment when I opened the door. He was in his 60s. In a brown coat over a dark sweater, holding his mail in one hand and a small grocery bag in the other. He'd been coming up the corridor from the stairs to the apartment across from Patrick's 2A, and had stopped to fish his keys out of his pocket. I had him before I had finished opening the door. It came in fast and heavy. He was carrying something he'd been carrying for years. Long, slow, weight he'd built on himself one wrong choice at a time, and not learned from, and not stopped, and not fixed. There was a woman in it, and there were children in it, and a job he'd lost, and a court date he'd missed, and a brother he hadn't spoken to in 8 years. None of it was a placement. All of it was him. He looked up from his keys when I came out of Patrick's apartment. He said good morning. I said it back. And he turned his key in the door and went into 2A and closed it behind him. I stood in the hallway with my hand still on the knob of Patrick's door. Patrick was a few feet behind me, still in his apartment, looking at me through the open doorway, and he asked if I was all right. I told him I was fine, closed his door, and went down the stairs at the same pace I had come up. Out on the sidewalk, I didn't go to the Taurus. I walked. I went up the block to the corner, took the corner, and walked the side street to the alley behind the walk-up. Eddie was beside me without my having seen him come out. The cold took the work out of my face. The man in 2A had not asked for anything. He had said good morning to a stranger on his floor and gone into his apartment with his mail. He was going to sit there and carry what he was carrying, and tomorrow he would carry it again. I had taken all of him in the time it took him to find his keys. I couldn't unhave it, or act on it, or call him, or knock on his door. And there wasn't anything I could have done if I'd been allowed to. What he was carrying he had built, and only he could take it apart, if at all. I walked the block back to the Taurus, Eddie beside me the whole length. After a minute he said it was the worst kind, the kind that needed no help getting where it was going. I let it sit, and he didn't push the point. Linda Alderton lived in a small brick row in a north side block where the houses pressed up against each other shoulder to shoulder. She was the youngest by 6 years, in a sweatshirt and jeans, with the kids' homework spread across her kitchen table. She had her sister's tiredness without her sister's organization. I had her from the front walk before I knocked. The pattern matched. The cost on her was lighter than Patrick's and shaped a little differently, more diffuse. A slow drag instead of a weight. Her 2 kids were upstairs, and I caught them on the way out by accident, and they were clean. She listened to me explain it without arguing. She had less to say than her brother and sister. And when I told her about the work tomorrow morning, she said, all right, she'd be there. She'd find someone to watch the kids. I drove home in the dark with the radio on talk and Eddie beside me. The bracelet was warm, the way it had been all day, and I had stopped knowing what its temperature meant. 40 people I hadn't asked to take in. The day not over. A man in 2A who didn't know I existed. I should have been wrecked, and I wasn't. I'd taken the stairs at Patrick's at a pace they didn't deserve and not noticed at the time. The body was running on something the day hadn't given it. There was a question waiting, and I didn't ask it tonight. Chapter 5. Ellis Alderton's house was on the south end, on a street where the trees had been planted the same year the houses had gone up, and both had grown together. It was a small clapboard with a deep porch and a postage stamp yard. I parked across from it at 5 minutes to 9. Nora's car came around the corner a minute behind me. But I sat in the Taurus another beat before getting out, because the man in 2A was still in the bracelet. He was 6 miles away, on the east side, in his apartment having his Wednesday morning, and the bracelet hadn't let him go since yesterday. Not a fresh catch, but a held one. I'd had him once, and the bracelet filed him and held him at the edge of my attention now, faint but present. Persistent as a name I'd memorized. I'd tried to drop him on the drive over. The bracelet didn't take instructions about what to drop. It made its own choices about what to keep and what to let go. I got out of the Taurus. Nora had the keys and let us in. The house had been closed up for a year, and it had the shut-up smell of a place kept up but not lived in. Nora had been in once a month to run the water and check the furnace, and that was all. She walked us through the main floor without saying much. The parlor was her mother's working room, a small writing desk by the window, a wooden chair that didn't match it, and a set of shelves with books I was going to want to look at later. Patrick and Linda came in together at 9:05. Nora let them in, and they both stood in the front hall taking the smell of the house and not saying anything for a while. I asked Nora if she had any idea who Delia was. She said yes. Delia was their mother's niece by her sister, who'd moved to Pittsburgh in the 80s and died young. Delia had grown up here until she was 9, and then in Pittsburgh until she was 19. And she'd come back 6 years ago. Nora had her number. Patrick and Linda hadn't seen her since their mother's funeral. I asked if Nora could call her and gave her what I needed her to say. Nora made the call from the parlor while the rest of us stood in the kitchen, and Delia was at the house in 20 minutes. She lived 9 blocks away. She came in annoyed and a little wary. A cousin she barely saw had pulled her over to a dead aunt's house at 9 in the morning. She was 31, in a peacoat over a flannel, dark hair short, ordinary face. I had her from the front porch before she came up the steps. She was clean. Whatever Elise had been protecting her from had stayed away. I introduced myself and told her what she'd missed. Her aunt had been carrying something for her. The carrying moved when her aunt died. And the move landed on Patrick and Nora and Linda. I didn't know whether her aunt would have told her any of this if she'd lived. I was going to clear what was on her cousins, and I needed her in the room because the work had originally been pointed at her, and the structure of it remembered that. Delia sat down on the couch in the parlor without saying much. She had been a difficult kid, she said, and her aunt had been kind to her in a way nobody else had been, and to do what I needed to do. The 4 of them were in the front room. Eddie and I were in the kitchen, and I was walking the length of it, hand running along the counter edge as I went. Eddie said, "You could push this. Tell them to come back next week." I knew what he was offering, and I knew what it would cost. The bracelet had been getting louder for 3 days, and stopping work was the option Marcus had given me, and I was choosing the other one. Eddie was not arguing for the one I wasn't taking. He was naming it once, so we both knew it had been there. I made another length of the counter and told him no on the way back. He didn't push. He had figured out a long time ago when to push and when not to. I called everyone into the parlor. Nora and Patrick and Linda took the chairs Ellis had left. Delia stayed on the small couch, and I stood in the middle. Eddie was at the back of the room near the bookshelf. I picked Patrick first. Held him as the target, the same drill I had been working all morning. Translated to the work and let the bracelet take it. The pull at range was clean and steady. The cost lifted off Patrick and came toward my wrist, and the structure absorbed cleanly. Then it kept absorbing. The warmth on my wrist climbed past where it had ever climbed before, past the parking lot incident from 4 months ago, past the warehouse pull 2 days back, into territory the bracelet hadn't shown me yet. I'd braced for the climb at the warehouse, and didn't brace this time. The thought to brace didn't arrive, and I worked through it without missing a step. The warmth leveled and held for a count of 3. Patrick was already sitting back, the work on him done, but the bracelet was still hot. Whatever Patrick had been carrying, the bracelet was using as a meal, and the meal took longer than it should have. Then the warmth eased back to ordinary. 3 breaths all the way down. I caught Eddie's eye across the room. He'd seen what I'd felt, and neither of us had a word for it yet. Patrick made a small sound and didn't say anything. Nobody else in the room knew the part of the work that mattered had happened. I did Nora next. Same shape, slower, because hers was older and more settled. The bracelet ran warm again, but the warmth stayed inside the line it had crossed for Patrick. The dissipation finished, and Nora did not make a sound. I did Linda last. The cost on her had thinned the most over 18 months, and the bracelet, already running hot from Patrick and Nora and into territory it had not shown me yet, was not running clean for the 3rd pull. The first pass on Linda's residue lifted as the first pass on Patrick had lifted, and the bracelet absorbed and dissipated, and the warmth on my wrist climbed and came back down. The second pass was when the bracelet reached for Delia. Not deliberately. The structure of the original placement still remembered Delia, and the bracelet, already running its own diagnostic, already past where I had been before, caught the structure memory and started to draw on it. The warmth on my wrist shifted, slow and definite, toward the side of the room where Delia was sitting on the couch. I anchored. I held Linda where she was, and the bracelet where it was, and did not let it take a step toward Delia. It took 2 seconds, maybe 3. The bracelet eased back to where it was supposed to be, and the second pass ran clean to its end. Linda put her hand to the side of her face and held it there. Delia hadn't looked up from the carpet. There was nothing on her to feel. Nobody else in the room knew the bracelet had reached for the wrong target. I didn't know what would have happened if I hadn't pulled the bracelet back. There was nothing in my training that said, nothing in Marcus's journal, and a strong sense I did not want to find out. Then the word for what I was doing went away from me. I had been thinking about the work in technical terms in the back of my head while I held Linda as the target. And the word for the part where the cost left the bearer and became unattached, the word I had used 1,000 times, was gone. Not the technique, just the word. I could not have said it out loud if someone had asked me. I covered without breaking, finished what was left of the pull, and let the room come back. Eddie was looking at me from the back of the room, and I let myself look at him this time. His solidity wasn't what it had been when he came in. The weave of his jacket where the collar turned was visible, that part was usual, but something underneath had thinned. When I looked at the bookshelf behind him, I could see the spines through where his shoulder had been, for a count of 2. Then his shoulder came back, and the spines went away. He held my look for a breath, then went back to standing as if nothing had happened. The word I'd lost came back a moment later. I made a closing pass on Delia. She needed nothing. There was no cost left on her, but the original placement still remembered her. You closed it where it had pointed, or you left it half open. I made the pass, and the structure closed. I told everyone the work was done. Patrick said he could feel it, surprised. Nora put her hand on the arm of her chair. Linda was crying without making any noise. Delia sat where she had been sitting the whole time and looked at the empty room they had grown up in. I told them what they should expect: sleep coming back, concentration coming back, themselves in pieces over the next few weeks. Their mother had been working on something difficult and had left it unfinished, and I did not have the right to tell them what to think about that. Nora thanked me and said she didn't know what to call what I did, and I told her she didn't need to call it anything. I left them in the parlor, and Eddie came with me out to the car. Chapter 6. In the Taurus, the engine off, Eddie waited until I had my hands on the wheel and was looking at the windshield. My hands were steady. They had no business being steady after the morning. And Eddie clocked them being steady and didn't say anything about it. He asked how the bleed was. Less when I focused, more when I didn't. That was the answer I had. He let it sit. He asked what I had lost in there. And I gave him the word. And that I'd had it back inside a minute. When he asked which one, I told him, and he didn't say anything else for a stretch. The radio was off. It ticked once through a stretch of static the off radio shouldn't have been making, settled, and went quiet again. Eddie's head came up and he looked at me. He didn't say what we had both heard, and neither did I. The bracelet was warm, same as it had been all day. After a minute, Eddie said, "Marcus told you something on the walk." "Yeah." He waited, and I didn't tell him. He looked at me a second longer, then out the windshield and didn't push. The silence sat between us, and we both knew it was sitting, and neither of us said anything into it. We drove east toward the office. April called about a mile out, and I put her on speaker. "Voss called," she said. "She got a call yesterday from a man named Caruso who wanted to talk to her about roads. She's meeting him Thursday morning, and she said you should know." I told April thanks. She asked if I was all right. Long week. She let me have it this time and hung up. Eddie watched the buildings going by. I parked behind my building and didn't get out for a minute. The frequency eater somewhere out beyond the bracelet's range was, according to Marcus, listening. The man in 2A on the east side was, according to nobody, going about his afternoon. Caruso was going to be in a room with Voss on Thursday. Eddie was beside me, and there was a thing I had not told him. I got out of the car and went up the back stairs to the apartment.
Chapter Guild, Stories for Your Mind.